Hi gang. In Warhammer 40,000, the protagonist is not any one individual, but a vast and sprawling empire, the Imperium of Man, which in the current timeline is going through the Era Indomitus. But this Imperium has persisted for 10,000 years, and it's gone through a lot of other eras and ages too, so let's look at how it got there. The Age of the Imperium is a term that, in 40k, refers to the last 10,000 years of in-game history, from around the 30th millennium CE to around the 41st millennium, the time that the Imperium of Man has existed and dominated the galaxy. But the Imperium itself has gone through lots of different changes in that period of time. Eras of unity and unrest, consolidation and religious fanaticism, each usually prompted by the events of the last one. And if you play 40k, you probably would have heard of a lot of them. The Age of Apostasy, the Time of Ending, each of these millennia-long events that happened, somewhere back in the depths of the lore. So in this video, I'm going to lay them all out next to each other and go through the ages of the Imperium. What are all these great long events, and how did one of them inevitably lead to the other? The start of the Age of the Imperium technically begins with the founding of the Imperium by the Emperor on Terra at the end of the Unification Wars. However, periods of history like the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade that followed it, and the Horus heresy that follows that, are usually dealt with on their own. When people think of the Age of the Imperium, they're usually talking about the end of the heresy through to the present day in 40k, the timeline where the Imperium as we know it solidified. However, even though they're often thought of as their own separate events, it's worth going over these initial periods just so we have some context. So let's start with unity. In the late 29th millennium, on Terra, the planet once known as Earth, the Emperor rose to prominence. At this point, great warp storms had engulfed the galaxy for 5,000 years, a period known as the Age of Strife. During the preceding Age of Technology, humanity had spread across the stars, but the resulting cybernetic revolt, a massive war against thinking machines, and then the descent of those warp storms, had fractured all of the old human empires and isolated those that remained. Many of these enclaves were destroyed by alien conquest, and for many of the survivors, their origins back on Earth had become a dimly remembered legend. Terra itself had become a wasteland of rival competing nation-states and warlords, fighting for resources and utilizing any scraps of advanced technology or esoteric knowledge that they could find. Accompanied first by human troops and then by the modified thunder warriors of the Legio Cataegis and his bodyguard, the Legio Custodes, the Emperor slowly brought the post-apocalyptic homeworld of humanity under his control by either force of arms or by the capitulation of the many states and petty warlords that occupied it, all under the raptor and lightning banners of unity. It's unknown when the Emperor's new state officially came into being, but by the middle of the 30th millennium, the Imperium was the dominant power on Terra, the Imperial Palace was under construction, and the first High Lords had been appointed to its civilian government. The Unification Wars were officially declared over in 712 M30, but by that point the Imperium had already started the next stage of expansion. The unstable armies of Thunder Warriors had been destroyed in the Battle of Mount Ararat in 669, but their replacements, the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines, had taken the fight off Terra, pacifying the Selenar gene cults on Luna. For the rest of the 700s, the Imperium consolidated its hold on the solar system. The Treaty of Mars was forged with the tech priests of the Mechanicum in 739, and the fleets of Saturn and Jupiter were brought into the fold, and by the end of the century, the Emperor was in a position to launch the next stage of his plans, the Great Crusade. The Great Crusade officially started in 798 M30 as the warp storms that had raged for 5 millennia subsided and thousands of expeditionary fleets left the solar system. Each of these was a military powerhouse of ancient starships, Astartes task forces, Imperial Army auxilia, and technologically advanced mechanicum assets, and over the next 200 years, they led a campaign of exploration and conquest across the galaxy. Originally, the campaign was led by the Emperor himself, but as the Crusade pushed on, many of the lost Primarchs, the genetic base for the Space Marine legions who had been lost in a warp rift back on Terra, were rediscovered, and they were placed in command of their respective forces. When the fleets discovered human enclaves, they were brought into compliance with the Imperium, often willingly and sometimes by force if necessary. Xenos threats, and those human empires that had diverged too far from the human genome, either by mutation or the incorporation of alien DNA, were exterminated mercilessly. And while many of these were wiped out by 1 or 2 fleets, some great wars were fought that sucked in the military might of this new Imperium. Of particular note are the Rangdan Genocides of the late 800s M30, in which the First Legion, the Dark Angels, led 3 wars against the horrific Xenos Rangda and their massive empire in the Halo stars. The last of those genocides saw the destruction of the Rangdan Empire along with the loss of over 50,000 Space Marines and the possible loss of whole legions. And at the end of the millennium, the Ullanor Crusade saw the deployment of over 100,000 Astartes and 8 million Imperial Army soldiers led by the Emperor and the Primarch Horus against the Orc Empire of Urlak-Urg, the greatest concentration of orcs that had ever been seen to that date. At the conclusion of the campaign, the Great Triumph of Ullanor was held, in which Horus was invested War Master of the Imperium, and the Emperor returned to Terra to work on his many other projects. By this point, humanity was close to total domination of the galaxy, but events took a turn for the worse when the new War Master, Horus, was corrupted by the forces of chaos. Convincing half of his brother Primarchs to his side, he then led a brutal rebellion that quickly turned into the civil war known as the Horus heresy. I have another video on the actual events of the heresy here, but it's fair to say that in 10 short years, the new Imperium was ripped apart. The Civil War saw Space Marine Legion fight Space Marine Legion, sometimes to the point of near destruction, but it also spread into every other arm of the Imperium. Planets declared either for the Emperor or for Horus, the Imperial Army and Auxilia split following their superiors in the legions, even the Mechanicum of Mars was split, with Mars falling to Horus and Titan legions and night houses turning on one another. By the time Horus was defeated, at the climax of the punishing Siege of Terra, the Imperium was a ruin. Terra was a wasteland once again, buried in the dust of the Imperial Palace. Human planets across the galaxy were burning ruins, and the Emperor himself, mortally wounded in his final duel with Horus, was confined to the Golden Throne, barely able to communicate with his followers. Whatever plans he had, lost forever. In the immediate aftermath of the Horus heresy, the Imperium entered into a period of time known as the Age of Rebirth, which lasted for the rest of the 31st and much of the 32nd millennia. This was a period of great change for the Imperium of Man, as it came to terms with the loss of the Emperor and had to figure out not only how to govern and organize itself, but also what its new objectives would be. Whatever the Emperor's plans had been after the Great Crusade were now lost. One of the central figures in this time was the Primarch Robute Guilliman of the Ultramarines. The Ultramarines had always been one of the more powerful and numerous of the Space Marine legions, and so Horus, when planning his rebellion, had made sure that they were deployed to the furthest reaches of the galaxy, trapped behind giant warp storms so they'd be unable to intervene. They finally reached Terra shortly after Horus had been killed by the Emperor, but their relative isolation and their massive recruitment base meant that, in the aftermath, they were by far the most numerous legion, and Robute Guilliman, a consummate strategist and logistician, took command of the broken Imperium as its Lord Commander. The first priority was to hunt down the remainder of the traitors who'd followed Horus, a period of running wars known as the Great Scouring that started in 15 M31 and is known to have continued for hundreds of years. During this time, Guilliman rallied his brother Primarchs to his side, and together they drove the remnants of the traitor legions from the galaxy, either destroying them or hounding them into the great warp rift known as the Eye of Terror. The Imperium also consolidated its losses, bringing swift retribution and punishment to those systems who had sided with the traitor Horus. Many of the home worlds of the traitor legions were subjected to exterminatus for their crimes. At the same time, Guilliman instituted sweeping reforms to the military of the Imperium, which focused now on consolidation and defense rather than constant expansion, and which were designed to limit the power any one commander could hold. During the second founding of 21 M31, the Loyalist Space Marine legions were broken down into chapters of 1,000 Astartes, each either tasked with a duty to protect the Imperium wherever threats occurred, or responsible for their own planet and surrounding area of space. One of these new chapters would retain the name, homeworld, and heraldry of the original legion, and the others would adopt new names and heraldries, and all would be responsible for sending a part of their gene seed back to Mars for regular testing. At the same time, the power of the old Imperial Army was split. The Imperial Navy was split from the Astra Militarum, and the Astra Militarum regiments were specialised, with combined arms regiments becoming very uncommon. The dizzying array of organisational structures and cultures that had existed was somewhat standardised by a new Departamento Munitorum that saw to the oversight and supply of the military, and who incorporated into every regiment and ship discipline officers known as commissars to ensure loyalty. A regimental commander or fleet captain who turned traitor would not only have to escape the bolt pistol of their commissars, but would quickly find themselves without armour support, or fleet transport, or artillery. Never again could a new Horus unite half the Imperium's armed forces under their banner. It was also at this time that the makeup of the High Lords of Terra, the 12 heads of imperial government, was formalised, as well as the Senatorum Imperialis that served underneath them. High Lords had existed before as part of the Council of Terra, but now the Great Crusade was over, they became the main power in control of the imperial system. The Great Scouring was a time of unification, but also a time of loss. In its many wars, most of the Loyalist Primarchs disappeared. Lion L. Johnson of the Dark Angels went missing soon into the period during the destruction of their homeworld, Caliban, which had turned against the Imperium. Corax of the Raven Guard, Liman Russ of the Space Wolves, Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, and Jagatai Khan of the White Scars all disappeared in battle with either traitors or Xenos raiders, and during the Battle of Thessala in 121 M31, Guilliman was fatally wounded by Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children and placed in stasis on the Ultramarines' homeworld of Macragge. In addition, the forces of Chaos started their long war in mid-M31, as Horus's former second-in-command, Abaddon the Despoiler, broke out of the eye on the first and smallest of his Black Crusades. All this loss also contributed to a strengthening of religious fervour in the Imperium. While the Emperor had always enforced the imperial truth, the banning of any worship or religion intended to starve the forces of chaos, there were always groups who had seen him as a god, and these beliefs had been growing since the end of the heresy. In early M32, seeing the usefulness of a church as a tool of unification and control, the largest of these emperor-worshipping cults, the Temple of the Saviour Emperor, was incorporated as the state religion of the Imperium, the Adeptus Ministorum. And a few hundred years later, the Ecclesiarch, the leader of the church, was given a seat on the Council of High Lords. By the middle of M32, the Imperium was in a state of relative peace and prosperity. The traitor legions were fighting their own wars for control of the Eye of Terror, and so the threat from chaos had greatly reduced, though the Imperium did suffer two more of the early Black Crusades in this millennia, as Abaddon assaulted Bellis Corona and Gerstal. However, in the relative absence of a regular chaos threat, the threat from Xenos had grown. In 544 M32, the Imperium came under attack from the largest Orc war in centuries during the War of the Beast. The Orc war boss, known as the Beast, united much of the Orc species, and the war came to a head when Orc attack moons materialized over Terra itself and demanded the surrender of the Imperium. The invasion sorely tested the resolve of the High Lords, who fractured and came back together again many times throughout the conflict. In the end, the Imperium was narrowly saved, both by the invocation of the Last Wall Protocol that brought the chapters of the old Imperial Fist Legion back together, and the reappearance of the Primarch Vulcan of the Salamanders. The ancient Orc homeworld of Olenor was attacked, and the War fractured, and Olenor was ordered to be subjected to Exterminatus, and as a response to the entire incident, the Death Watch were formed, a force of Space Marines drawn from different chapters to better protect the Imperium from Xenos threats. However, the War of the Beast destabilizing effect did not stop there. At the end of the war, the newly invested Lord Commander of the Imperium, Maximus Thane of the Imperial Fists, ordered a fourth founding of Space Marine chapters, and then stepped down to serve as Chapter Master of the Imperial Fists, leaving the previous Grand Master of Assassins, Drakan Vangarich, as Lord Protector of the Imperium in his stead. Almost immediately, in 546 M32, contemptuous of the infighting within the High Lords, Vangarich enacted a coup known as the Beheading, where the entire High Lords were assassinated and replaced by his personal choices. Vangarich then ruled the Imperium for the next century as an increasingly unstable tyrant, until Thane and the Imperial Fists, finally having cleared away the remnants of the War of the Beast, returned and deposed him. The brief period of anarchy that followed was eventually stabilised by a council of over 50 Space Marine chapter masters who installed a new set of High Lords during the restoration of the Senatorum Imperialis in 642, before retreating from the imperial politics and from the rank of Lord Commander. These events cross over with the next major age of the Imperium, the Forging, which lasted from the middle of M32 through to the end of M34. This is often considered a golden age for the Imperium, where many of the systems of government still in use in the 41st millennium were established or strengthened, and the Imperium as a whole expanded. Many systems and empires that had evaded the clutches of the Great Crusade were finally brought under the control of the Imperium, and the naval passages, trade routes, and communication systems that held the Imperium together were formalized and strengthened. Astropathic choirs and relays were stationed on most Imperial worlds, with major hubs established on the best garrisoned and on the most important worlds, military outposts like Macragge, industrial linchpins like Armageddon, or fleet bases like Bacca. The massive expansion of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica required might even have led to the Astropath Wars of 888 M32, though little else is known about that conflict. Entering into M33, the ecclesiarchy, in a move that would become quite common over the next few millennia, attempted to seize more power. The Wars of the Confessor were a series of conflicts that saw a number of shrine worlds added to the domains of the Adeptus Ministorum. We also have the advent of what I'm going to call here random events, the sort of thing that all these timelines are filled with, but don't actually ever get mentioned again. In 615, we get the mysterious return of the Blade of Infinity, a pre-imperial human cruiser that entered the warp 20,000 years before. It mostly warned against impending chaos cults, and in 831, the honoured dead of the Segmentum Solar rose up against warp incursions with literally no other explanation. As we move into M34, the Imperium comes under threat from a number of big events. At the start of the millennia, in 01, the Fourth Black Crusade assaulted the world of Alfanor, and soon after, the Pale Wasting occurred in the galactic northeast, a star-spawned plague of Xenos horror that originated in the Ghoul stars and involved unknown alien monstrosities and nightmare engines that slaughtered whole sectors. 11 Space Marine chapters were lost in the aftermath, with the Nova Marines as the only recorded survivor. And in the random events column, the Black Templars fought a war against the Caco Dominus, an alien entity whose psychic powers had granted it dominion over 1,300 systems. And in 666 M34, a number of warp stars appeared around the Eye of Terra, which sucked in nearby planets. Generally, the Forging is an age in which the control of the Imperium was solidified and re-established. STC fragments are rediscovered throughout the era, which held off the slow technological decline, as the formal rules of the Imperium and the expectation on its client planets were raised, with brutal punishments becoming normal for transgressions against the rule of the High Lords. Though in many ways the Imperium stabilised and strengthened, the familiar culture of paranoia and fear became commonplace in even the highest halls of government, while the menials of the Imperium slid further into ignorance. The effects of that consolidation of power would be felt in the 35th millennium, which is dominated by an event known as the Nova Terra Interregnum. Railing against this oppressive new system, a number of worlds in the segmentum Pacificus rebelled, led by the Council on the planet of Nova Terra, in a series of rebellions that lasted 900 years, also called the Time of Two Emperors. Much of the western segmentum Pacificus seceded from the Imperium, creating two parallel power structures with immense resources. For much of the time, this became a relatively low-level conflict that played out in border campaigns and the occasional crusade of retribution against particularly rebellious systems, but the split hadn't affected the Imperium over. Chaos cults took advantage of the lack of certainty, and fringe religious sects became common, even within the Imperium's other priesthood, the Adeptus Mechanicum. The Moirai Schism, a doomsday cult that foretold the end of Martian independence, plunged tech priests across the galaxy into civil war for centuries until the world of Moirai was destroyed and the cult slowly wiped out by Mars. Eventually, the interregnum was ended by, yet again, a power grab by the ecclesiarchy, who originally attempted a coup to force the Imperium into becoming a religious state under their overall control. In the Halls of Terror, they were outmaneuvered, but the absolute rejection of this by the rebels in Nova Terra made them heretics, and a colossal war of faith was launched into the sector which killed billions. Eventually, by the end of the millennium, the interregnum period was over, and the Imperium reunited once again. There were brief attempts to recover what was lost. The whole millennia involved at least 10 known Space Marine foundings, many very small and isolated, ending with the 21st founding in 991 M35, though it would later transpire that many of the Space Marine chapters established in this cursed founding would be horribly flawed. And then, as the clock turned to M36, the Adeptus Mechanicus launched Wars of Recovery into the Mortuum chain, recovering ancient STC patterns. And of course, there were the usual footnote wars throughout the millennium. However, the end of the Nova Terra Interregnum was not the end of the strife. Emerging from the fires of the Interregnum stronger than ever, the Adeptus Ministorum once again attempted to seize power. In 200 M36, the High Lord Goge Vandire took on the dual roles of Master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch, ushering in a period known as the Reign of Blood that lasted 7 decades. The paranoid Vandire, now in command of much of the Imperium's armed forces, saw conspiracies everywhere. Planets burned under the guns of both the Imperial Guard and the Fraterus Templar on his whim. Wars of faith were launched against loyal worlds for any perceived slight only known to the High Lord. For much of this period, the Mechanicus and the Space Marine chapters stayed well out of it, seeing it as an internal struggle within the government of the Imperium. But eventually, when the preacher Sebastian Thor arose on the world of Dimamar and the Retribution fleet sent to destroy him disappeared into a warp storm, evermore known as the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath, many chapters joined his banner. Thor's Confederation of Light journeyed to Terra, where the assembled Space Marine forces defeated Vandire's bodyguards and restored the rule of the High Lords once again. In the aftermath, the Ordo Hereticus of the Inquisition was established, and the Adeptus Ministorum was banned from retaining men under arms, and that led to the rise of the Adepta Sororitas as a way of circumventing that rule. But this spiritual disruption didn't end there. A few decades later, Cardinal Bucaris rose to the leadership of the shrine world of Gathalamor, a preacher so dedicated to the Emperor that he enslaved entire planetary populations to the building of great monuments. Isolated from the wider Imperium by great warp storms, the Cardinal's new creed, known as the Plague of Unbelief, promoted the idea of radical self-reliance and self-interest and the destruction of the weakest in society. His speeches turning the planets he visited into hotbeds of mob violence and disruption. His words turned armies and fleets to his side until eventually he made the mistake of attempting to co-opt the nearby Space Wolves chapter into his proto-empire, and that backfired horribly. The wolves smashed his armies, and an uprising soon after by the charismatic confessor Dolan forced his forces back to Gathalamor, where Dolan's words eventually changed the minds of Bakaris' supporters, and they turned on the apostate cardinal. If these two great disasters weren't enough, the Imperium was also shaken by the usual invasions and wars, especially towards the end of the millennium. In 724, the Fifth Black Crusade, the Tide of Blood, enveloped the Elysian sector, destroying 2 Space Marine chapters, and this came a couple of years before the Web of Intrigue disaster, which of course has no other record, so we don't know what that is. Then, in 901, the Sixth Black Crusade destroyed the Forge world of Arcreach. This whole era, the 36th millennium, was known as the Age of Apostasy, and by the end of the millennium, the spiritual malaise had seemingly reached the Emperor himself. By 989 M36, the tech priest that manned the Golden Throne noticed an increase in the requirement for sacrificial psychers, and by the end of the millennium, the number of psychers sacrificed daily to keep the Golden Throne in operation had increased 4-fold, and the black ships who scoured the Imperium for latent psychers had to increase their patrols. Of course, eras of colossal religious civil war do tend to upset the balance, and the 37th millennium, known as the Age of Redemption, saw the Imperium attempt to atone for the problems of the previous age, often overreaching into fanaticism once again. In 20 M37, the High Lords of Terra started the Great Cull. This was a systematic purge of the Adeptus Terra and a number of worlds across the galaxy that have fallen too far during the previous Age of Apostasy, with the intent of preventing such an event as the Reign of Blood from ever happening again. But the real marker of the Age of Redemption were the many crusades that were launched in the Emperor's name, often as attempts by various preachers and confessors to atone for the heresy of the 36th millennium. A movement gathered around the Saint Basilicus in the 3rd century M37, who launched the Abyssal Crusade in 321. Declaring 30 Space Marine chapters to be wanting in their devotion to the Imperium, Basilicus launched his crusade into the Eye of Terror, challenging the chapters to bring those worlds lost to humanity since before the rise of the Imperium into the Emperor's light. The crusade disappeared into the fringes of the Eye for the rest of the millennium, only emerging in early M38 after purging over 400 worlds. However, when they returned, battered and bloody, the Master of the Vorpal Swords chapter, Convac Lan, declared that Saint Basilicus was in fact a false idol, that veneration of him was heresy, and the veterans of the Crusade spent the next year destroying any shrine or sepulchre dedicated to him and burning his tracts and texts. Also in M37, the Lost Crusade, a movement of pilgrims and menials that spread across thousands of planets, rose up in search of a better, more tolerant galaxy. They crowded aboard civilian vessels and bulk transports, seeking to take their petition directly to Terra, but they were swallowed up by the warp and never emerged. The Ecclusiad War was fought in the 5th century of M37 against a group of radical tech priests called the Apostles of the Blind King, who'd taken their beliefs to an extreme, declaring that humanity itself was an affront to the machine god. Using Dark Age technology, they wiped out an area of the outer segmentum obscurus by making the local stars go supernova, and were only stopped when a rogue trader expedition was able to locate and destroy the palace vessel of the Blind King itself. The Benedictine War was launched by the Black Templars, alongside 5 orders militant of the Adeptus Sororitas, the new army of the Ecclesiarchy, against the Eldari. The campaign conquered several Eldar worlds for the Imperium, but was so costly that after 2 Black Templars High Marshals were killed, the Ecclesiarch attempted to halt its progress and declare victory. The Black Templars, of course, refused to stop and kept fighting until the rest of the worlds in the subsector were purged of Xenos. And amongst all this, the Imperium also faced crusades of a different kind as it suffered attack by its usual enemies. The 7th and 8th Black Crusades were launched from the Eye of Terror. The 7th, the Ghost War, saw Chaos-aligned fleets escape the Cadian Gate and just disappear, harrying sectors across the Imperium, and the 8th, the Skullgather, saw Abaddon enact a series of ritualistic massacres designed to weaken the barriers between the warp and real space. After all of these exciting periods of horrific religious civil war, and then the various attempts to make up for it, the Nova Terra Interregnum of M35, the Age of Apostasy of M36, and the Age of Redemption of M37, from M38, the Imperium entered an age of decline, retroactively proactively referred to as the wasting. This dark period from early M38 to around the middle of M41 saw the Imperium facing a slowly growing barrage of attacks from Chaos and Xenos powers. It was death from 1,000 cuts, as its systems and resources grew ever thinner, not helped by the aggression and military overcommitment of the previous age. In the 38th millennium, the Imperium suffered the 9th Black Crusade, weakening reality around the worlds of Anticanis, and the sudden return of a number of space hulks in 666, which, upon inspection, turned out to be the remains of the Lost Crusade from over a millennia before. Their ships fused together in twisted and unnatural ways. In the 39th millennium, the 10th and 11th Black Crusades assaulted the Helican sector and utilised captured Orc weird boys to weaken reality, but there was a brief hope during the Imperium's Redemption Crusade of 131 M39. Great heroes arose, one for each segmentum of the Imperium, later declared to be saints, sent by the Emperor, and for 50 years they pushed back the tide of darkness before mysteriously disappearing along with most records of the event itself. Whatever happened, it wasn't enough. The waning continued through the 40th millennium and into the early 41st, when huge wars shook the Imperium. The Gothic War, starting in 131 M41 and lasting 20 years, saw the forces of chaos ravage the Gothic sector in an attempt to seize control of the ancient black stone fortresses, resulting in the involvement of dozens of Space Marine chapters and the destruction of several Imperial planets. And while the Macarian Crusades of the 300s M41 were lauded initially as a great victory, they ended in collapse. Lord Solar Macarius forged the greatest army the Imperium had seen in millennia and led it in a series of conquests in the western reaches of the galaxy, returning over 1,000 worlds to the Emperor's light in just 7 years. But after his death, his commanders fell to infighting, and the conflict that resulted, called the Macarian heresy, lasted 70 years and pulled in 100 Space Marine chapters before its end. And the world of Armageddon also suffered the first of its 3 destructive invasions in 444 M41, as it was invaded by the demon Primarch Angron and his forces of Khorne. The planet, but not the people, were narrowly saved by the intervention of the Space Wolves. As if in response to these millennia of loss, in 500, the worlds of the Imperium were swept with visions. Ecclesiarchs, mystics, and holy men across the Imperium were overcome with images of the Emperor's tears, or saw statues of him weeping for the plight of humanity. The years that followed, the latter half of the 41st millennium, are known as the Time of Ending, a term coined in 744 M41 by Tagarath, the seer of Carino, who predicted a time of great upheaval and was swiftly executed for doing so by the Inquisition. To go into every event during these few centuries would take far too long. Almost all of Warhammer 40k's lore was set in this time period, so the number of recorded invasions, battles, and losses is colossal. It's definitely the subject for a different video if people really want that, but in short, it was a time when the Imperium came under attack with a frequency never before seen from enemies old and new. Many of the biggest Xenos threats to the Imperium only became apparent in the dying days of the 41st millennium. First contact was made with the Tau Empire in 742, resulting in the Damocles Gulf conflict in the Ultima segmentum as the new empire expanded. The Imperium's response was then swiftly disrupted by the emergence of another new Xenos threat as the first major Tyranid invasion hit the galaxy in 745. Hive Fleet Behemoth battered its way through the Ultima segmentum until it was finally defeated during the Battle of Macragge. And then in 897 M41, a third new Xenos threat was revealed as the long slumber of the Necrons started to come to an end, the Imperial Shrine at Sanctuary 101 being wiped off the map by Necron raiders. All 3 of these new threats would only grow over the next few centuries. And existing Xenos threats also reared their heads. The world of Armageddon was invaded 2 more times in 941 and 997 by the resurgent orc armies of Gazikal Magaruk Thraka. In 976, War Grok smashed into the Forge World of Ryza, and in 989, even more orcs from War Snagrod invaded and laid waste to Rin's world, almost destroying the Crimson Fists chapter. The usual rebellions and brushfire conflicts increased, often as a response to increased tithes needed to fight back the tide of aliens. Examples like the Fourth Quadrant Rebellion of the late 700s saw a large part of the Segmentum Solar dissolve into anarchy, and the later Badab War of the early 900s was a direct response to the Imperium draining resources from the volatile Maelstrom Zone. By the final decade of the 41st millennium, in the late 900s, the Imperium was embattled from all sides. The Second and Third Tyrannic Wars against Hive Fleet's Kraken and then Leviathan had pressed the Imperium, kicking off war in the Octarius sector, and seeing the Blood Angels' homeworld of Baal facing invasion. The Tau's Third Sphere expansion had seen losses to the east, while the Space Wolves' homeworld of Fenris was invaded by Magnus the Red and his 1,000 sons, who summoned their demon homeworld, the planet of the Sorcerers, back into real space. The Astronomicon dimmed in 999 M41, leading to the unrest known as the Night of 1,000 Rebellions, as chaos cults rose up on planets across the galaxy, to freak awakenings of psychic power across the Imperium, and to astropaths being haunted by waves of alternately terror and complete psychic silence. And then finally, the Eye of Terror opened once more, and in 999, Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade assaulted Cadia, destroying it completely and leading to the spread of the Great Rift across the galaxy as the Eye finally burst its borders, a ripple of warp space crossover that forever divided the galaxy in two. Great chaos fleets sailed forth from the rift, led by the ancient demon primarchs to ravage the Imperium. The Imperial Palace itself was even attacked during a second siege by the forces of Khorne, defended this time by the Adeptus Custodes. Whole planets were swallowed up by the rift and turned into demon worlds as the Imperium was split in half. But there was one thread of hope for the Imperium. At the height of the 13th Black Crusade, and aided by the Inari Eldar, the Ultramar campaign and the Terran Crusade saw Rebute Guilliman healed and resurrected. Forcing his way to Terra, he took swift command of the Imperium, replacing many of the High Lords, communing with the Emperor himself, and assuming the dual titles of Lord Commander, again, and Imperial Regent. With this new power, he declared the Indomitus Crusade, a vast undertaking that folded in all the Imperium's armed forces in order to stabilize and shore up the defenses of Imperium Sanctus, the area of the Imperium on Terra's side of the Great Rift. In his stead, he placed the Blood Angels chapter master Dante in command of Imperium Nihilus, the area on the far side of the rift. Leading this new Indomitus Crusade were the Primaris Space Marines, the results of a project developed in secret by the Magos Belisarius Call on Guilliman's orders way back during the Scouring. The Crusade initially had thousands of Grey Shield brothers at its fore, but over time they were split off to join embattled Space Marine chapters across the galaxy, swift torchbearer fleets bringing the technology required and scores of reinforcements to chapter homeworlds across the Imperium. And it's this crusade currently ongoing in the lore that gives this new age its name, the Era Indomitus, which is when current 40k is set, and also where this history has to end because they haven't written any further yet. The Age of the Imperium, at least the bit that's most commonly referred to as that, the 10 millennia since the end of the Horus heresy, has mostly been an age of long, slow decline. Whatever the Emperor had originally planned, the dominance of the Imperium over the galaxy, the slow marshalling and safeguarding of humanity's psychic potential, the starvation of chaos, and even the move to using the ancient webway instead of warp travel, all of that was lost in the fires of the heresy, and the Imperium has become ideologically stuck ever since. The Great Crusade, the great warmongering military power that was the Crusade-era Imperium, was a means to an end, something that would eventually be replaced, moved on from, but because the Emperor was removed halfway through, it's that militaristic Imperium, the one from the Great Crusade, that became the new normal. The Imperium's history since is one of reactions to reactions to reactions, all happening in an attempt to live up to those days. A sudden attack prompts a wave of shame, which prompts an age of religious tyranny, which prompts an age of desperate crusading penance, and so on and so on. Over that period, the Imperium became increasingly weighed down by dogmatic religion and centuries, then millennia of tradition, constantly grinding itself into dust, patching over its failure with new departments and armies. And the tragedy of all that is that it's all done in an attempt to recapture some barely remembered glory days that in reality were only ever meant to be temporary. There's a chance that the Era Indomitus will pull the Imperium free of its slow death spiral, but even Robute Guilliman can't totally ignore the monolithic and hidebound organisation that it's become, and even if he could, well, he's a product of that militaristic temporary golden age anyway. But there we go. I've made videos in more detail about some of these ages. Links are in the thing below, and I'll probably make more videos going into detail about the others. But that should give you a wide view on how the Imperium has fared over the 10,000 years of its in-game history, and how it ended up where it is in the Era Indomitus. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see more about the Imperium, there's a little box popping up there to the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, there are the usual links to the Patreon and the YouTube membership scheme in the thing below. See ya.